The Civil War is like a sibling fight because it involves people in the same country, like family members who become upset about issues they don't agree on, and it ends up in a fight, or in the case of a country, with a war. We are going to explain some of the issues that led to the war and some major things that happened during and after the war. Geographical differences between North and South. There are several large differences between the North and South in the 1800s. The major differences were the economies, the cities, and the population. The North economy was based on industries, while the South economy was based on agriculture. Like the economies, the cities of the North and South were different too. The North had a large immigrant population and people wanted to live there. In the South, people typically lived on farms. In the 1860s, the North was populated with about 31 million people, while the South had only 12 million people. Part of the South's population included slaves. Approximately 25% of the South's population owned slaves. Population plays a very large role concerning why the North and South are different. The North was against slavery. Compromises. Before the Civil War, the North and the South argued about representation in the Union. Three major compromises were created, but in the end, neither side was happy and the Union went to war. Slavery also was a part of the three compromises. The first compromise, the Great Compromise, was during the writing of the Constitution, where smaller states were concerned that the larger states would have more power and the North did not want Southern slaves to count in the population. The compromise called for a two-house legislature in which only one house would have representation based on population. The second compromise was called the Missouri Compromise of 1820. It required that there would be an equal number of free and slave states. With Missouri and Maine wanting to join the Union as free states, the balance would be off. It was agreed that Missouri would join as a slave state and Maine as a free state, and the balance would remain. Another 30 years passed, and the North and the South made an even bigger compromise, called the Compromise of 1850. This compromise would try to settle the slavery question once and for all by making the North and South happy. The compromise allowed the slaves to work for the South, but it did not allow the slave trade to continue in Washington, D.C. California joined the Union as a free state. The sovereignty of UT and NM were upheld. The Texas-Mexico dispute was settled, and the Fugitive Slave Act was added. Though the compromise was agreed upon, there was a lot of tension between the North and the South. Slavery and the Civil War. The Civil War was fought partly over the issue of slavery. The people who lived in the North opposed slavery more than the people in the South. The people in the North did not need slavery as much as the South did. The people living in the North owned, operated, and worked in factories and mills. The South required slavery to work on the farms. During the war, the South did use slaves in the war effort, though they were reluctant to send their slaves to the front for two reasons. First, they risked the loss of their most valuable property, and second, because the men were overworked and mistreated. They frequently returned to their homes in very poor physical condition, so the owners often sent only their most unmanageable slaves to the army. The use of slaves on the battlefield enabled the South to fight longer than would have been possible otherwise. The overwhelming majority of slaves, however, remained on their plantations in the countryside. The North has the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, which was the African American former slaves of the Union Army. In 1863, President Lincoln, who detested slavery, issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Through the proclamation, Lincoln silenced his abolitionist critics in the North, diffused intervention sentiment abroad, and invigorated black slave resistors to continue their efforts in the South. The Emancipation Proclamation, though, did not legally free a single slave. Civil War battles. Major battles that were turning points in the war took place in Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Virginia. The most key battle in the war was the Battle of Gettysburg. This battle led to a great win for the North and end with the surrender of the South. This was also the most deadly battle in the Civil War, with a combined total of 50,000 dead. In Virginia, there were three battles that changed the war and were key to the North's victory. In Georgia, the South had a big win at the start, but not enough to defeat the North in the end. Abe Lincoln's and Jefferson Davis' point of view for their side. Abraham Lincoln had a strong view of his North. He thought they were more populated with soldiers, so they would have a better chance to win the war. Along with more soldiers, the North had the newly invented Morse code that would allow orders to be sent to generals quickly. Lincoln also had another weapon of war, the railroad. This helped troops move to a war spot faster and gain more supplies too. To Lincoln, adding up all his advantages made him very confident going into war. Lincoln gave his side 10 out of 10 to win the war. Jefferson Davis had a good view of his Southern troops, as did Lincoln. He knew that some things would help lead to victory and others not so much. He knew that the geographical and economical differences would be a disadvantage. But with his army and the slaves, he was sure to even out the playing field. All Jefferson knew was that on the battlefield he would beat the North. Even though he didn't have all the advantages of the North, he knew he could give the North a well-tested fight. After the Civil War. After the Civil War, it was easy for the North to get around because of the railroads and the major cities were not damaged by the battles. The North didn't have to worry about much because the war was over. They were finally on their way to doing what they wanted, and the slaves had been freed. In the South, life was hard after the Civil War. Most of the cities were destroyed, and there was a lot of cleanup. Many people had to reconstruct their homes and hope for the best, and they didn't have the slaves to help with the repair and to work the farm. As you can see, after the Civil War, both sides had different things to do and hope to have an even better life. As in a sibling fight, both sides are affected by the battle and need to work to get back to normal.